June 3rd, 1945, a displaced persons camp outside Waldheim, Germany. The war had been over for less than a month, but the human wreckage it left behind continued to arrive daily at Allied facilities across occupied Europe. Refugees, former prisoners, civilians who had survived the Reich's collapse, all of them converging on camps that were supposed to provide shelter, food, and medical care, while the authorities figured out what to do with millions of displaced people scattered across a shattered continent. Captain Theodor Brennan, chief medical officer at the Waldheim facility, had seen thousands of patients since the camp opened in May. Malnutrition cases, disease, untreated injuries, psychological trauma. The medical manifestations of total war were endless and overwhelming, a tide of suffering that seemed to have no end, even though the guns had finally gone silent. He had thought, after weeks of processing survivors from concentration camps and bombed cities, that nothing could shock him anymore. He was wrong. The transport truck arrived just after 10 in the morning. Number 47 in the camp's intake logs, standard procedure, routine processing that Brennan's staff had performed hundreds of times before. The truck carried 43 civilians who had been found sheltering in the ruins of a town east of Waldheim. Registration, preliminary health screening, assignment to appropriate barracks. The machinery of humanitarian relief turning steadily, processing human beings with the same efficiency that had once processed weapons and ammunition. Nurse Margaret Aldrich was handling intake that morning. 32 years old, trained at Massachusetts General before the war, she had volunteered for overseas service in 1943 and had been processing displaced persons for 8 months. She had seen malnutrition. She had seen disease. She had seen injuries that would have killed most people, survivors who had somehow kept breathing through circumstances that defied medical explanation. But when the 17th person stepped down from the truck, Margaret Aldrich gasped. The sound was audible across the intake area. Other nurses turned to look. Even the camp administrator, who had been reviewing paperwork at a nearby table, glanced up at the involuntary expression of shock. The figure that emerged from the transport was barely recognizable as human. A girl. The records would say 17 years old, though she looked simultaneously much younger and infinitely older. Someone who existed outside the normal categories of age, suspended in a state that human beings were never meant to occupy. She weighed 68 pounds. Her bones were visible through skin that seemed translucent in the morning light. Her eyes, enormous in a skull-like face, held an expression that Nurse Aldrich would later describe in her report as hauntingly aware, as though the girl understood exactly how she appeared and was observing their reactions with detached curiosity, the way a scientist might observe the results of an experiment. She could barely walk. 2 other civilians from the transport had to help her down from the truck bed, supporting her weight, even though there was almost no weight to support. Her body was so light that the 2 men seemed to be carrying a bundle of clothing rather than a human being. She wore a threadbare dress that hung on her frame like fabric draped over a skeleton, no longer designed to fit a body but simply to cover bones. When she tried to speak, answering Nurse Aldrich's standard intake questions, her voice was so weak that the nurse had to lean close to hear responses that came in barely audible German. Name: Lieselotte Kraus. Most people called her Lisa. Age: 17. Place of origin: a small town 40 kilometers east, destroyed now. Nothing left but ruins and memories. Family: none. Father dead on the Eastern Front in 1943. Mother and younger brother killed in an Allied bombing raid in February. No other relatives, no connections, no support system. Alone in a collapsing Germany with nowhere to go and no one to help. Nurse Aldrich was writing this information in her intake log when she noticed something that made her pause: the girl's hands. They were skeletal, the bones of her fingers clearly visible beneath paper-thin skin. But there was something else. Calluses. Not the random calluses of someone who had done hard labor or worked with rough materials. These were specific, patterned, located on the palms and the bases of the fingers in a way that suggested repetitive motion, some kind of regular activity performed over and over again with methodical precision. Margaret Aldrich had been a nurse long enough to recognize when something did not fit the expected pattern. And these calluses did not fit. They looked deliberate, intentional, as though this girl had been doing something specific during her time in hiding, something that required repeated hand movements in the same positions again and again. But before she could ask about it, the girl spoke again, this time in English. "I estimate my core body temperature at approximately 35 degrees Celsius. Heart rate is likely below 40 beats per minute. Blood pressure, systolic, is probably around 70. I believe I am experiencing hypovolemic shock due to severe dehydration and prolonged caloric deficit. I would recommend gradual rewarming protocols and intravenous saline administration, but slowly. Rapid rehydration could cause complications." Nurse Aldrich stared at her. The girl had just provided a preliminary medical assessment of her own condition, using technical terminology. In English, with a German accent but perfect grammar and precise medical vocabulary. This was not the speech of a helpless victim. This was the speech of someone who had studied medicine, someone who understood physiology and pathology, someone who could analyze her own physical state with clinical detachment. Margaret Aldrich immediately called for Captain Brennan. Theodore Brennan had been a surgeon in civilian life, Chicago. A good practice. He had trained at Johns Hopkins, one of the best medical schools in America, and had spent 15 years building a reputation as a skilled and knowledgeable physician. He had seen poverty during the Depression. He had treated malnutrition cases when families could not afford food, and children came to his clinic with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs. He considered himself experienced, knowledgeable about the full spectrum of human suffering and medical pathology. But when he first saw Liselotte Krauss in the intake tent, his medical training struggled to process what he was observing. 68 pounds on a frame that should have carried at least 110. A body mass index so low it should not have been compatible with consciousness, much less the ability to walk and speak coherently. Muscle mass virtually non-existent, replaced by the wasted appearance of advanced starvation. Skin stretched over bones with almost no subcutaneous fat remaining, every contour of the skeleton visible beneath a thin layer of tissue that seemed more like parchment than human skin. Her face was the worst part. The skull beneath the skin clearly visible, cheekbones protruding sharply, temples hollowed, lips cracked and colorless. Yet her gaze remained focused, tracking his movements with an intensity that seemed wrong in someone so close to death. Those oversized eyes held not fear or confusion, but a kind of measuring intelligence. She was studying him even as he studied her. But she was alive, breathing, conscious, speaking. Brennan's first assumption was that she was a concentration camp survivor. The physical presentation matched what he had seen from other camps, Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, the extreme emaciation that resulted from systematic starvation over months or years, the body consuming itself in a desperate attempt to maintain basic functions, burning through fat reserves first, then muscle tissue, then anything else it could break down for energy. He began his examination with standard protocols, vital signs first. Always start with the basics: heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory function. The fundamental measurements that would indicate how close to death the patient was, how much time they had before the body finally gave up. Heart rate. He counted carefully, one hand on her wrist where the radial pulse should have been. 38 beats per minute. Dangerously low. The heart was conserving energy, beating as slowly as possible while still maintaining circulation. Any slower and she would lose consciousness. Any slower, and the vital organs would begin to shut down from lack of oxygenated blood. Blood pressure, 70/40, barely enough to keep blood flowing to the brain. She should have been dizzy, disoriented, unable to think clearly. But her focus remained sharp. Her responses were coherent. Somehow, impossibly, she was maintaining cognitive function at a blood pressure that should have rendered her unconscious. Respiratory rate, 12 breaths per minute, shallow but steady. The lungs working efficiently, extracting every molecule of oxygen from each breath, compensating for the reduced cardiac output by maximizing gas exchange. Temperature, 35.2 degrees Celsius, hypothermia. The body had lowered its core temperature to conserve energy, reducing metabolic demands by letting itself run cold. A survival adaptation, but a dangerous one. Any colder, and she would slip into severe hypothermia. Any colder, and the organs would begin to fail. Brennan recorded these numbers in his notes, but he was already noticing details that did not fit the standard starvation pattern. Her teeth were damaged, several cavities, evidence of long-term nutritional deficiency, but they showed signs of maintenance. Someone had been cleaning them, trying to preserve dental health even in extreme circumstances. There was no buildup of plaque, no severe gum disease, just the basic damage from malnutrition, but not the complete neglect that he usually saw in concentration camp survivors. Her hair was thin, very thin, but it was not falling out in clumps the way it should have been with severe protein deficiency. It was still attached to her scalp, still showing some structural integrity, as though her body had managed to preserve this non-essential tissue despite burning through everything else. Her vision appeared functional, no cloudiness, no signs of vitamin A deficiency that should have caused problems at this level of malnutrition. When he moved his hand across her field of vision, her pupils tracked the movement with precision. And then there were the calluses on her hands. Brennan examined them carefully. They were not random, they were specific, patterned, located in places that suggested deliberate activity. The kind of calluses that form when someone performs the same motion repeatedly, day after day, building up thickened skin in response to consistent friction or pressure. He had seen these kinds of calluses before. On laborers, on soldiers who handled weapons, on people who did specific types of manual work that required the same hand positions again and again. But what kind of manual work could produce this pattern? What had this girl been doing during her time in hiding? Brennan looked at her face again. That focused, observing stare. That expression of detached interest, as though she was studying his examination of her with the same methodical attention that he was applying to her condition. "Fräulein Kraus," he said in careful German. His German was limited, but he had learned enough medical terminology to communicate with patients. "Were you in a concentration camp?" She shook her head weakly. The movement seemed to cost her energy, as though even this small physical action required calculation and expenditure of precious reserves. "No," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words were clear. "I was in hiding, living in ruins, alone." Brennan felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the temperature in the tent. Alone, not imprisoned, not forced into a camp with hundreds or thousands of others. Alone. She had done this to herself. Or rather, she had managed her own survival in circumstances where most people would have died. She had been making her own decisions, controlling her own environment, choosing her own strategies. And somehow, impossibly, she had survived long enough to be found. "How long?" Brennan asked. 3 months, she said. March 15th to June 3rd, 80 days. She knew the exact count. Of course she did. Brennan continued his examination, but his mind was already racing ahead, trying to understand what he was seeing. This was not passive starvation. This was not someone who had simply endured suffering until rescue arrived. This was something else. something that his medical training had not prepared him for. He examined her abdomen next. In severe starvation cases, the abdomen usually became concave, the stomach shrinking as the body used every available resource. But Liselotte's abdomen was distended, not bloated with fluid, the way he would expect from kwashiorkor or liver failure. Distended with something solid, something that her body could not process or expel. "What have you been eating?" Brennan asked carefully. She looked at him with that measuring stare. "Preserved food for the first 32 days, 400 calories daily, then vegetation for approximately 3 weeks, grass, bark, roots. Minimal nutritional value but provided gastric content. Then clay, forest clay specifically, after testing 3 varieties, 200 to 300 grams per day from April the 22nd onward." Brennan's pen stopped moving across his notes. She had not just eaten whatever she could find, she had tested, compared, selected the optimal substance based on empirical observation. She had turned starvation into an experiment with herself as the only subject. "Clay," Brennan repeated. "You tested 3 varieties." "Yes, river clay caused nausea, mountain clay induced vomiting, forest clay had the best tolerance profile. I documented the results." Documented. "Where?" Brennan asked. "On the wall of my shelter. If I died, I wanted the information to survive, so someone else who hid there might benefit from the data." She said it so matter-of-factly, as though planning for her own death and ensuring her suffering had scientific value was the most rational thing in the world, which, Brennan realized with growing horror, it probably had been, for her, in those circumstances. "I need to conduct a full examination," Brennan said. "With X-rays if possible. I need to understand what is happening in your digestive system." "Of course," Liselotte said. "I have been curious about the internal effects as well. External observation can only provide limited data." She was curious about her own starvation, about what it had done to her body internally. Brennan called for his senior staff immediately. The examination took 3 hours. X-rays revealed that Liselotte's stomach and upper intestines were packed with clay, not randomly distributed but layered in a way that suggested careful, controlled consumption over an extended period. The clay had formed a semi-solid mass that was slowly moving through her digestive tract but had not caused obstruction. Somehow, she had managed to consume enough clay to fill her stomach without causing the blockages and complications that should have killed her. Blood work showed severe anemia, electrolyte imbalances, kidney function compromised but still operational, liver enzymes elevated but not in the critical range. Every system in her body was operating at minimal capacity, running on reserves that should have been exhausted weeks ago. But the most disturbing discovery came when Brennan examined the pattern of muscle loss. In normal starvation, the body breaks down muscle tissue somewhat randomly, taking protein from wherever it can find it to maintain critical functions. But Liselotte's muscle loss was not random, it was specific, patterned. Her legs showed approximately 85% muscle atrophy. The muscles of her thighs and calves had been almost completely consumed, leaving only bone and connective tissue wrapped in skin. She could barely support her own weight on these wasted legs. Her arms showed about 70% atrophy. Still severe, but less than her legs. The muscles of her forearms and upper arms still had some definition, some remaining tissue that had not been broken down. Her core muscles, the muscles of her abdomen and back, showed only about 60% atrophy. Still significant, but notably less than her extremities. These muscles had been preserved relative to the rest of her body, as though her metabolism had prioritized them for some reason. Brennan had never seen muscle loss distributed this way. It looked almost intentional, as though Liselotte's body had decided which muscles to sacrifice first and which to preserve until absolutely necessary. But bodies did not make decisions. Bodies followed biochemical processes, breaking down tissue according to physiological rules that had nothing to do with intention or planning. Unless something else was happening, unless extreme discipline, extreme stillness, extreme control over movement and positioning could somehow influence which muscles the body catabolized first. Brennan did not want to believe it. It seemed impossible. But the evidence was there in the measurements, in the physical examination, in the distribution of remaining muscle tissue. This girl had not just endured starvation. She had managed it, shaped it, directed it according to some internal logic that allowed her to survive longer than she should have. Captain Brennan, one of the camp administrators, had entered the examination room. He looked agitated. "We sent a search team to the location where Fräulein Krause was hiding," he said. "They have found something that you need to see immediately." The ruined factory was 12 kilometers east of the camp. It had been a textile mill before the war, producing cloth for civilian and military use. Allied bombing had destroyed most of the structure in February, leaving only partial walls and collapsed sections of roof. It should have been completely uninhabitable, just another pile of rubble in a landscape of destruction, but someone had been living there. The search team had found a small room in the least damaged section of the factory. The ceiling was partially intact, providing protection from rain. The walls were still standing, offering shelter from wind. Someone had barricaded the entrance with debris, creating a hidden space that would not have been visible to anyone passing by. Inside, the room showed evidence of careful organization. A sleeping area in one corner made from scraps of cloth and insulation material. A small collection of containers for water. A few items that might have been scavenged from the surrounding ruins. But what had caught the search team's attention was the wall. One entire wall of the room was covered with marks, not random scratches or mindless graffiti. Organized marks, systematic marks, marks that formed words and numbers and dates, carved into the plaster with something sharp, arranged in neat columns and rows. Brennan stood in the ruined factory room looking at the wall, feeling something cold settle in his chest. This was not a survival diary. This was not emotional documentation of suffering, the kind of desperate record that people sometimes kept to maintain their sanity in extreme circumstances. This was a laboratory notebook. The marks were organized by date, starting in mid-March and continuing through late May. Each date had multiple entries noting specific observations and measurements. March 12th, menstruation ceased, expected physiological response to caloric deficit. March 28th, hair thinning observed, vision blur at distances greater than 10 meters. Probable vitamin A deficiency. April 3, orthostatic hypertension severe. Approximately 20 seconds stabilization required after standing. BP estimated 80/45. April the 15, skin turgor test greater than 3 seconds. Severe dehydration, water intake insufficient but limited bioavailability. April the 22, experiment A initiated, river clay consumption, 200 grams, nausea moderate, no vomiting. April the 29th, experiment B, forest clay, better texture, easier to swallow, reduced nausea versus experiment A. May 6th, cognitive function test, recited periodic tables successfully, memory intact despite declining physical state. May the 12th, position rotation protocol, 6-hour intervals, minimizing pressure sores while preserving core circulation. May 18th, motor control test, 5 push-ups no longer possible, upper body strength insufficient. May 25th, final mark. Insufficient strength to continue documentation. If found, please record findings. Brennan read through the marks slowly, translating the German in his head, trying to understand what he was seeing. Lieselotte Krause had not been surviving in these ruins. She had been conducting an experiment on herself, documenting her own decline with scientific precision, recording physiological changes the way a researcher would record data from a laboratory subject. She had tested different types of clay, comparing their effects. She had monitored her cognitive function, checking to make sure her mind remained sharp, even as her body failed. She had performed physical tests, measuring her declining capabilities with detachment. She had even documented her positioning protocol, rotating her body systematically to manage pressure distribution. She had turned herself into data. One of the search team members pointed to another section of the room. "Captain, there's more." In the corner, near the sleeping area, someone had arranged 3 piles of material. Each pile was labeled with scratches in the floor. Type A, river clay, high mineral content, causes nausea. Type B, forest clay, optimal texture, lowest negative effects. Selected. Type C, mountain clay, too dense. Severe gastric distress, rejected. She had collected samples, tested them systematically, evaluated their properties, selected the optimal substance for consumption based on empirical observation and systematic comparison. This was not the behavior of a desperate girl eating dirt to fill her stomach. This was the behavior of someone approaching starvation as a problem to be solved through scientific method. Brennan found one more document before they left the factory. Tucked beneath the sleeping materials, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a small notebook. The pages were filled with tiny handwriting, German words packed densely together to conserve paper. The first page had a title: "Survival Data for whoever finds this place. May this information extend your life beyond mine." She had assumed she would die. She had accepted it as the most probable outcome, but she had wanted her death to generate useful knowledge. She had wanted the information she gathered to help someone else, some other person who might hide in these ruins and need to know what worked and what did not work in the desperate mathematics of staying alive. Brennan carefully placed the notebook in his medical bag. Evidence. Documentation. A window into a form of survival that he had never encountered before. On the way back to the camp, driving through the ruined German countryside, Brennan thought about what he had seen. The marks on the wall, the collected clay samples arranged by experimental outcome, the notebook with its careful observations and hypothesis testing. Lieselotte Krause had survived by becoming something other than a frightened girl. She had survived by transforming herself into an observer, a researcher, a mind that could study its own body with clinical detachment, even as that body consumed itself cell by cell. She had measured her own dying, documented it, organized it into experimental protocols, made it into something that could be understood and analyzed rather than simply suffered, and somehow, impossibly, that transformation had kept her alive long enough to be found. The question that Brennan could not answer, the question that would haunt him for years afterward, was what price she had paid for that survival, what parts of herself she had sacrificed in order to become someone who could approach starvation as a scientific problem rather than a human tragedy. When they arrived back at the camp, Lieselotte was resting in the medical tent. She looked up when Brennan entered, her observant stare tracking his movement. "Captain," she said softly, "did you find my room?" "Yes," Brennan said. "Did you find the wall?" "Yes." She nodded slowly as though confirming something she had expected. "Good," she said. "Then you understand, I was not just surviving, I was documenting survival methodology. Someone needed to know what extends life, what preserves cognitive function when the body fails, what strategies actually work versus which ones just feel comforting but provide no benefit." "Why?" Brennan asked. "Why did you approach it that way?" Lieselotte's gaze remained steady on his face. "Because if I let myself just suffer," she said, "I would have surrendered. I would have died in the first month, like the others. But if I made it into research, into systematic data collection, into something that had purpose beyond my own survival, then I could continue, I could function, I could make rational decisions instead of emotional ones that would have killed me." She paused, gathering strength for more words. "My father was a doctor," she said. Wehrmacht medical corps. He died in 1943, but before the war he taught me anatomy, physiology, the scientific method, how to observe without letting emotion cloud judgment, how to record data accurately even under difficult conditions. She took a shallow breath. I used what he taught me, she continued. I turned myself into a case study. It was the only way I could survive as long as I did, not as a girl who lost her family, but as a researcher who happened to be studying an extreme situation from the inside, from a unique perspective that no one else could provide. Brennan sat down on the edge of her cot, trying to process the implications of what she was describing. You conducted experiments on yourself, he said. Yes. You tested different types of clay to determine which one you could consume most safely. Yes. Empirical testing was the only way to know. You monitored your cognitive function to track mental decline. Yes, if my mind failed, all the physical survival became meaningless. You documented everything so that if you died, someone else might benefit from the information. Yes, that gave my suffering purpose. Value. It meant that even death would not be complete failure if the data survived. Brennan was quiet for a moment. Fräulein Krause, he finally said, I have treated 2,000 patients since this camp opened. Starvation victims, disease cases, people who have suffered every imaginable form of deprivation and trauma. But I have never seen anyone who approached their own suffering the way you did. Lieselotta's expression did not change. That same careful observation, as though she were noting his reaction for future reference. Is that assessment positive or negative, Captain? She asked. Brennan did not have an answer. He was not sure there was an answer that made sense in any framework he knew how to apply. This 17-year-old girl had survived the unsurvivable by becoming something that human beings were perhaps never meant to become. A mind so disciplined that it could observe its own body's destruction with the detachment of an outside observer. A consciousness that could transform suffering into data, desperation into methodology. She had lived. Undeniably, remarkably, she had lived when all probability suggested death. But what had lived? The girl who entered those ruins in March? Or something else, something harder and colder and more capable of endurance, but fundamentally different from what that girl had been? I am going to request a full psychological evaluation, Brennan said. Major Whitmore, our camp psychiatrist, he needs to assess your mental state and determine what kind of support you might need going forward. Of course, Lieselotta said. I am curious about the psychological mechanisms myself. It would be valuable to understand what allowed me to maintain the necessary detachment. That information might help others in similar situations. Even now, even in safety, even in the presence of a doctor who wanted to help her, she was thinking like a researcher, approaching her own psychological state as another variable to be measured and recorded for potential future application. Brennan stood up, feeling a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. We will continue your medical treatment, he said. Gradual refeeding. Careful monitoring for complications. You are going to recover physically, Fräulein Krause. Your body will heal. He paused at the tent entrance, looking back at her fragile form on the cot. But I do not know yet what else you might need, he said quietly, or what else might even be possible. Lieselotte nodded, understanding the unspoken question beneath his words. Captain Brennan, she said, I survived by becoming someone who could calculate instead of feel. I do not know if I can become someone who feels instead of calculates. I am not certain that person still exists inside me. She may have died in those ruins, even though this body did not. She closed her eyes, exhausted from the conversation. But I am alive, she whispered, whatever that means now. Whatever I have become, I am alive. Brennan left the tent and walked out into the late afternoon sun. Around him, the displaced persons camp continued its work. Thousands of people, all of them survivors, all of them carrying their own stories of what they had endured and how they had persisted through the collapse of everything they had known. But none of them, he thought, had survived quite the way Lieselotte Krauss had. She had survived by measuring her own dying with such precision that she could postpone it day by day, calculation by calculation. And in doing so, she had revealed something about human endurance that Brennan was not sure he wanted to understand. Something about the calculations that people could make when survival became the only thing that mattered. Something about the price of staying alive when staying alive required sacrificing the very things that made life worth living in the first place. The marks on the wall in that ruined factory would stay there for decades. Other people would find them. Researchers would study them. They would become famous in certain circles, a historical curiosity, evidence of extraordinary human resilience and the extremes of rational self-management. But Brennan, who had seen them first, who had read them while standing in the room where a 17-year-old girl had turned herself into an experiment, would never forget what they really represented, not triumph, not tragedy, but something in between, something that had no comfortable name or easy interpretation. The survival of a girl who learned to measure dying so precisely that she could postpone it through pure discipline and calculation, until finally someone found her and pulled her back into the world of people who still remembered how to feel instead of analyze. Whether that was a rescue or something else entirely, Brennan did not know. He would spend the rest of his life trying to answer that question. The second day after Lieselotte Krauss arrived at the Waldheim camp, Captain Brennan sat across from her in a private corner of the medical tent and asked her to explain her decision-making process. Not just what she had done, but how she had chosen her strategies, the reasoning behind each choice, the calculations that had guided her through 80 days of progressive starvation. Lieselotte sat propped against pillows, still too weak to maintain an upright position without support. Her skeletal frame barely made an impression on the cot beneath her, but her focus remained sharp, ready to provide the information he requested with the same precision that she had used to document everything else. She began with the critical decision point, the moment when her path diverged from thousands of other displaced Germans who had made different choices. February 1945. The bombing that killed her mother and younger brother, the destruction of their town by Allied aircraft targeting what remained of Germany's industrial capacity. She had been out searching for food when it happened, walking through streets that had already been bombed twice before, looking for anything edible in the rubble of destroyed homes and abandoned shops. When she returned, the building where her family had been sheltering no longer existed. Just a crater. Scattered debris, the smell of smoke and cordite that seemed to hang over every German city in those final months of the war. She had searched for survivors, found her mother's body on the second day. Her brother she never found, probably buried too deep beneath tons of concrete and steel, or vaporized entirely in the initial blast. I was alone, Lieselotte said, 17 years old, no relatives. The town was destroyed. Most people were dead or had already fled westward. She paused, her breathing shallow, but controlled. I had 3 options, she continued. Join a refugee column heading west, stay in the ruins and wait for Allied or Soviet forces, or find somewhere to hide and wait until the chaos settled. Brennan leaned forward. Why did you choose isolation? Lieselotte's expression remained neutral, that same observant quality, as though she were describing someone else's decisions rather than her own. The refugee columns represented too many uncontrollable variables, she said. Disease spreading through crowded groups, food distribution I could not rely on, the risk of Soviet soldiers finding the column, chaos of thousands of desperate people with no organization. She took a careful breath, conserving energy. Staying in the town ruins was equally problematic. Soldiers would come through, either Allied or Soviet. They might provide help, but they might not. They might requisition any remaining food or shelter. I would be dependent on their decisions, their priorities, no control over outcomes. So you chose to hide alone, Brennan said. I chose to maximize control, Liselotte corrected. If I was alone, I only had to manage my own survival. No one could take my resources, no one could make decisions that endangered me. I could calculate everything precisely based on known variables rather than hoping for favorable circumstances. The logic was ruthless, but Brennan could not deny that it had worked. She had survived when thousands of others making seemingly more reasonable choices had died. "Tell me about finding the factory," Brennan said. Liselotte's gaze shifted slightly as though accessing a different section of memory. "I spent 5 days searching for an optimal location," she said. "Somewhere that provided shelter but was not obvious, somewhere that people would not search or try to occupy, somewhere defensible if necessary." The textile factory had been bombed in early February. Most of the structure had collapsed, but one corner section remained partially intact, with walls and portions of the roof still standing. It was far enough from the town centre that casual scavengers would not bother with it. Remote enough that military units moving through the area would not waste time investigating what appeared to be complete ruins. She had spent 3 days preparing it, clearing debris from one small room, collecting materials to barricade the entrance from inside, finding containers for water storage, gathering what supplies she could scavenge from the surrounding destruction. "I found 4 tins of preserved vegetables," she said, 1 kilogram of grain, some cloth for bedding, a metal cup, a knife. She had calculated the caloric content of her food supply with precision. Approximately 28,000 calories total. If she consumed 2,000 calories per day, the normal requirement for a young woman, the food would last 14 days. Completely insufficient. But if she reduced intake to 800 calories per day, accepting significant hunger but not immediate starvation, the food could last 35 days. And if she reduced further to 400 calories per day, accepting rapid weight loss and declining strength, she could extend the supply to 70 days. "I chose 400, Liselotte said. "I calculated that the war would end within 60 to 90 days. Allied forces were clearly advancing. Someone would establish displaced persons facilities. I needed to survive until systematic relief arrived." 70 days. Just barely enough if everything went according to plan. It almost had been. "But you consumed the food faster than planned," Brennan noted, having read her wall documentation. "Yes, 32 days instead of 70. I underestimated the difficulty of precise rationing under progressive hunger. I also did not account for the energy expenditure of maintaining the shelter and collecting water. By mid-March, the food was gone." She spoke about this miscalculation with the same detachment that she applied to everything else. A data point, a variable that had not performed as predicted, information for future reference. When the food ran out, she had implemented what she called Phase 2, vegetation. Grass from the areas around the factory where spring growth had begun, tree bark carefully stripped from branches, roots dug from the ground using the knife she had scavenged. She understood that none of it provided significant nutrition. The human digestive system cannot extract meaningful calories from cellulose, but it provided bulk, the sensation of eating, the psychological comfort of maintaining routine. "I knew it was not sustaining me physically," Liselotte said, "but it helped maintain mental stability, the routine of gathering food, preparing it, consuming it. These activities provided structure, purpose. They prevented the kind of psychological collapse that I observed in others during those first weeks." Brennan interrupted. "You observed others?" "Yes," Liselotte said. "Before I went into hiding, I spent time near refugee gathering points. I watched 17 different people over 5 days. I noted who survived longest and who died quickly. I documented patterns. This was the 5th major revelation. Before entering her own survival situation, Lieselotte had conducted field research. She had studied other survivors like experimental subjects, learning from their successes and failures, building a knowledge base that would inform her own strategies. "I observed that emotional people died faster," she said. "Those who cried constantly, who expressed fear openly, who could not control their reactions, they exhausted themselves. They made poor decisions, they gave up." She had taken notes. Mental notes, since she had no paper then, but systematic observations nonetheless. "I also observed that people who maintained routines survived longer, those who rationed carefully, who kept themselves clean despite difficult circumstances, who continued purposeful activities even when the situation seemed hopeless." She had learned, adapted, prepared herself psychologically for what she would need to become. For 3 weeks after her food ran out, she had continued eating vegetation, documenting the progression of starvation symptoms on the wall of her room with systematic precision. March 12th. Menstruation stopped, expected, the body shutting down non-essential reproductive functions. Late March. Hair thinning, vision blurring, vitamin deficiencies manifesting. Early April. Severe weakness, orthostatic hypertension, the body conserving every possible resource. She had documented all of it as though observing a laboratory subject rather than herself. And then, in mid-April, she had discovered the clay deposits near the stream that ran past the factory ruins. Brennan needed to understand this part precisely. The clay consumption was the most unusual aspect of her survival strategy, and it had clearly made a significant difference in her ability to endure. "Tell me about the clay decision," he said. "How you went from eating vegetation to eating earth." Lieselotte nodded slightly as though she had been expecting this question and had prepared her answer. "My father taught me about kaolin clay," she said. "Before the war, he explained that it was used medically to treat dysentery. It absorbs toxins and provides bulk to digestive contents without being absorbed into the bloodstream. He said soldiers sometimes consumed it in the field when proper medicine was not available. Kaolin, China clay, white clay, a substance that had been used in medicine for centuries precisely because it was inert. It passed through the digestive system without being absorbed, without providing nutrition, but also without causing harm in moderate quantities." "I was becoming irrational by early April," Lieselotte continued. "The constant hunger was affecting my cognitive function. I could feel my mind beginning to deteriorate. I needed something to reduce the hunger signals enough to allow clear thinking again." She had remembered her father's lessons, and she had formed a hypothesis. If clay could provide gastric distension without toxicity, if it could make the stomach feel full even though it provided no nutrition, then perhaps consuming clay could reduce hunger enough to preserve mental function. Perhaps it could extend survival time by reducing the psychological torture of constant starvation, allowing her to maintain the rational decision-making that kept her alive. But she understood that not all clay was the same. Some types contained harmful minerals, some were too abrasive and could damage the digestive tract. She needed to test different varieties systematically to find one that was safe for consumption. "I collected 3 types," Lieselotte said. "River clay from the stream bed, forest clay from deposits in the woods, mountain clay from exposed rock faces nearby. I tested small amounts of each using a standardized protocol." This was the full revelation of her experimental methodology. She had not desperately eaten dirt. She had conducted controlled experiments with proper methodology. Experiment A, river clay. Test dose 50 grams mixed with water. Result, moderate nausea within 1 hour. Tolerable but unpleasant. I documented this on the wall and waited 24 hours to ensure no delayed effects. Experiment B, forest clay. Test dose 50 grams. Result, minimal nausea. The clay seemed to settle in my stomach with less distress. Texture was smoother, easier to swallow. I marked this as the preferable option. Experiment C, mountain clay. Test dose 50 grams. Result: severe gastric distress within 30 minutes. I vomited the entire amount. I noted this type as unsuitable for consumption. She had selected type B, forest clay, and beginning April the 22nd, she had consumed approximately 200 to 300 grams per day, mixed with water to form a paste, swallowed in small amounts throughout the day. It filled my stomach, Lieselotte said. The hunger did not disappear, but it became manageable. More importantly, I could think clearly again. I could continue documenting. I could maintain cognitive function and rational decision-making. Brennan sat back, trying to process the implications. This 17-year-old girl had approached her own starvation as a medical problem to be solved through systematic experimentation. She had tested hypotheses, collected data, made adjustments based on observed results. She had applied rigorous scientific methodology to the desperate act of eating dirt, transforming it from an act of desperation into a calculated survival strategy with empirical justification. Did you know the clay was not nutritious? Brennan asked. Of course, Lieselotte said. I understood perfectly that clay provides no calories, no vitamins, no absorbable minerals. It was not feeding me. It was managing the symptoms of starvation to extend the time before complete cognitive collapse. Every day of maintained consciousness was another day that someone might find me. The clay itself would not save me, but it might keep me functional long enough for actual rescue to arrive. She had calculated it precisely. If eating clay extended her ability to think clearly by even 1 week, that was 7 additional days for circumstances to change. 7 more chances for rescue. The clay would not prevent death, but it might postpone it long enough for salvation to arrive. And it had, barely. By June 3rd, when she was found, she had been perhaps 10 to 15 days away from complete organ failure, but she had lasted long enough. Later that afternoon, Major Nathaniel Whitmore arrived at the camp to conduct the psychological evaluation that Brennan had requested. Whitmore was 42 years old, a psychiatrist who had specialized in combat trauma before the war. He had treated soldiers returning from battlefields across Europe, men who had seen horrors that broke their minds as surely as bullets broke their bodies. He understood psychological damage. He understood trauma responses. He understood how human minds fractured under extreme stress. But when he sat down with Lieselotte Krauss for their first session, he realized within 10 minutes that he was dealing with something outside his usual diagnostic framework. He began with standard trauma assessment questions, designed to evaluate emotional state, cognitive function, reality testing. "How did you feel when your mother died?" he asked. "Devastated, terrified, completely alone." The words came without hesitation. She was not denying the emotions. But these feelings were not useful for survival. They consumed energy and impaired decision-making, so I limited my engagement with them to scheduled periods. "Scheduled periods?" Whitmore repeated carefully. "Yes. I allowed myself 10 minutes before sleep each day to experience grief fully. Structured emotional expression. This prevented the feelings from overwhelming me during times when I needed to remain functional and make rational decisions." Whitmore wrote notes. This was not dissociation in the classic sense. Lieselotte was not disconnected from her emotions. She acknowledged them. She recognized them as valid experiences, but she had compartmentalized them, scheduled them, managed them like any other resource that needed to be rationed for optimal survival. "Did you cry during these scheduled times?" he asked. "Yes, but I limited duration. Crying uses energy through physical exertion. Tears require hydration that was already limited. Uncontrolled emotional expression would have wasted resources that I needed for physical survival." She had calculated the metabolic cost of crying, and she had budgeted for it the way she budgeted calories and water. Whitmore continued the assessment, probing deeper, testing her reality contact, her sense of self, her capacity for emotional connection. The results were simultaneously reassuring and deeply concerning. Lieselotte showed no signs of psychosis, no delusions, no hallucinations. Her cognitive function was intact. Her memory was clear. She understood where she was, what had happened, what her current situation was. But her emotional affect was profoundly altered. When she spoke about her own experiences, her tone remained level, descriptive, as though she were reading from a medical case report rather than describing her own suffering. Whitmore tried a different approach. He showed her photographs of other starvation victims from different camps. Standard trauma assessment technique. Observing how patients respond to images of suffering can reveal their emotional state and capacity for empathy. Lieselotte looked at each photograph carefully, studied them with focused attention, examined the physical details, and then she began to provide clinical analysis. "This one," she said, pointing to a photograph of a woman with severe edema. "The swelling pattern suggests rapid refeeding syndrome. She probably received too much nutrition too quickly after prolonged starvation. Classic medical error. Could have been prevented with gradual caloric increase over 2 to 3 weeks." Whitmore felt something cold settle in his chest. She continued, moving to the next photograph. "This one. Notice the muscle wasting pattern, random distribution across the body, indicates passive starvation with no attempt to manage which tissues were catabolized. Inefficient. This person probably died faster than necessary due to lack of strategic energy conservation." She was not responding emotionally to the photographs. She was conducting clinical analysis, observing, categorizing, learning from the physiological evidence of others' suffering and death. "Fräulein Krauss," Whitmore said carefully, "when you look at these photographs of people who suffered and died from starvation, what do you feel?" She looked at him with that observant, measuring stare. "I feel that these people did not have adequate information about survival physiology," she said. "If they had understood the mechanisms of starvation better, if they had approached it strategically rather than just enduring it passively, some of them might have survived longer. That is why systematic documentation is important. That is why my wall marks and experimental data might help others in similar situations. No sadness for the dead, no horror at their suffering, no empathy for the humans visible in the photographs. Just the researchers' clinical regret that valuable data had been lost when these subjects died without documenting their experiences." Whitmore closed the folder of photographs. He needed to completely reconsider his diagnostic approach. Lieselotte was not dissociated. She was not depersonalized in the way those terms were traditionally defined in psychiatric literature. She was something else, something that existing diagnostic categories could not quite capture. "I want to propose a hypothesis," Whitmore said. "Tell me if this sounds accurate to your experience." Lieselotte nodded, interested. "During your time in hiding," Whitmore continued, "you made a conscious, deliberate choice to suppress emotional responses in order to enhance rational decision-making. You treated this as a survival strategy, allocating emotional resources the same way you allocated food and water. You knew what you were doing. It was intentional." "Yes," Lieselotte said, "that is accurate. And this strategy was adaptive. It helped you survive. It gave you the psychological distance needed to make difficult choices that someone experiencing normal emotional responses could not have made." "Correct. But now you are safe. The immediate threat is gone. The war is over. You are receiving medical care. Yet you are still operating in that analytical mode, still suppressing emotional responses automatically, still analyzing rather than feeling." Lieselotte considered this carefully before responding. "Yes," she said slowly. "I notice that I am still using the same cognitive patterns that I developed during hiding, but I am uncertain how to change them. The analytical mode has become automatic, default. I am not sure I remember how to process experience emotionally instead of rationally. It has been 4 months since I allowed myself to feel things normally." Whitmore wrote more notes, formulating a new diagnostic concept as he listened. Not dissociation, not depersonalization. Something different that he would eventually term crisis rationality. A state where extreme prolonged stress triggers adaptive hyperanalytical thinking that suppresses emotional processing to maximize survival probability. The brain essentially decides that emotion is too expensive, too resource-intensive, and shifts into pure rational mode to optimize decision-making under severe resource constraints. It was adaptive, functional. It kept people alive in circumstances where normal emotional processing would lead to death through poor decisions or psychological collapse. But it created long-term problems because humans were not designed to operate permanently in that mode. Emotional processing was not just luxury or weakness. It was part of how people formed connections, processed experiences, integrated themselves into social groups, found meaning and purpose beyond mere biological continuation. Without emotional capacity, a person could function, but they could not truly live in any meaningful human sense. Fräulein Krause, Whitmore said gently, I want to ask you something important, and I want you to answer honestly rather than analytically. She looked at him with focused attention. Do you want to feel things again? The way you did before the war? Before you had to suppress your emotions to survive? For a long moment, Liselott was silent. Whitmore could see her processing the question, considering how to answer. I do not know, she finally said. Feeling is dangerous. Feeling made me vulnerable. Feeling would have killed me in those ruins. If I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I lost, the full horror of what I experienced, I might not be able to function at all. Why would I want to return to a state that is objectively less functional and more vulnerable? Because you are not in those ruins anymore, Whitmore said. You are safe. You can afford to feel things now. Can I? Liselotte asked. The world is still dangerous, still unpredictable. I have no family, no home, no clear future. If I allow myself to feel fully, I may lose the ability to make rational decisions. And rational decision-making is what has kept me alive. It is who I am now. There it was. The core issue that Whitmore had been trying to identify. Liselotte had survived by becoming an analyst, a living calculator, and now, even in safety, she was afraid to stop analyzing because analysis had become her identity. Her purpose, the thing that made her special, that made her survival meaningful rather than just lucky. If she stopped being the girl who measured dying, what would she be? Just another orphan, just another displaced person with a tragic story and an uncertain future. But if she remained locked in analytical mode, she would never be fully human again, never form deep connections, never experience joy or love or any of the things that made survival worthwhile. She was trapped, and she might not be able to escape the trap even if she wanted to, because the trap had become her identity. The medical mysteries continued to accumulate as Liselotte gained strength over the following week. Brennan discovered 5 significant anomalies that deepened his understanding of just how unusual her survival had been. The first anomaly was the muscle loss pattern he had noticed during initial examination. Detailed measurements confirmed the specificity. Leg muscles showing 85% atrophy, arms 70%, core muscles only 60%. This distribution was not random, it appeared intentional. Brennan consulted with Dr. Wilhelm Eckhart, a German metabolism specialist who had recently arrived at the camp. It should not be possible, Eckhart said, examining the measurements with disbelief. Catabolism during starvation follows biochemical pathways. The body breaks down muscle tissue according to enzymatic processes, hormonal signals, not conscious intention. But look at the specificity of the pattern, Brennan insisted. Eckhart studied the data more carefully, his expression gradually changing from skepticism to reluctant fascination. Unless, he said slowly, she somehow influenced the mechanical stress signals that regulate protein breakdown. if she maintained near-complete stillness for extended periods, if she positioned herself very deliberately to minimize use of certain muscle groups while performing small, specific movements to signal which muscles needed to remain functional. The theory was speculative, controversial, but the physical evidence supported it. Liselotta's wall marks included position rotation protocols. She had documented rotating her sleeping position every 6 hours precisely, apparently to manage pressure distribution while preserving core circulation. She had noted performing specific limited exercises, 10 arm movements per day, 10 core contractions, apparently designed to signal her metabolism that these functions needed to be preserved. She appeared to have influenced her own catabolism through extreme discipline and strategic activity management. The second anomaly was the pressure sore distribution. Every long-term bedridden patient developed them, but Liselotte's sores were positioned specifically to preserve core blood flow, as though she had deliberately accepted tissue damage in certain locations to protect more critical areas. Again, extreme discipline, choosing which parts of herself to sacrifice in order to protect other parts. The third anomaly was the clay impaction. X-rays showed substantial clay throughout her digestive system. But somehow, she had avoided complete obstruction. Somehow, she had managed consumption precisely enough to fill her stomach without causing fatal blockage. I calculated maximum safe volume based on observations of gastric distress, she explained when asked. 300 grams appeared to be the threshold. More caused severe cramping that lasted hours. Less was inefficient for hunger management, so I maintained that dose as closely as possible. She had found the exact safe quantity through self-experimentation, trial, and careful observation of her own body's responses. The fourth anomaly involved metabolic efficiency. Her blood work showed extremely high ketone bodies, indicating deep ketosis. Expected, but her protein breakdown markers were lower than predicted for someone at her weight and starvation duration, as though extreme stillness and careful energy management had actually reduced the rate at which her body consumed its own tissues, as though she had made her metabolism more efficient through sheer discipline. The fifth anomaly was cognitive preservation. At her body weight, at her level of malnutrition, she should have experienced significant cognitive decline, confusion, disorientation, impaired memory and reasoning. But Liselotta's mind remained remarkably sharp. She could recite complex information, perform calculations, engage in sophisticated logical analysis. Her wall marks included cognitive self-tests, reciting multiplication tables, naming chemical elements, solving logic problems that she had memorized before her decline began. By testing herself regularly, by engaging in mental exercises, she had apparently helped preserve cognitive function when the brain should have been shutting down to conserve energy. 2 weeks into Liselotte's treatment, the search teams made another discovery that would provide crucial context for understanding her survival. 3 kilometers from the factory where Liselotte had hidden, in a different section of ruins, they found 2 bodies, both female, both young, both dead from starvation, probably during April. The first body was identified through papers found nearby as Maria Fischer, 19 years old. Records showed she had been displaced from a town close to Waldheim, probably hiding in the ruins during the same time period as Liselotte. The second body was Katrine Schmidt, 16 years old. Similar circumstances, similar timeline. Both had died alone. Both had apparently been attempting to survive in the ruins while waiting for help to arrive. This discovery would provide the comparison that made Liselotte's survival truly remarkable. Brennan examined both bodies carefully, conducting post-mortem assessments to understand how they had died and why they had failed, where Liselotte had succeeded. Maria Fischer had died approximately 6 weeks into hiding. Her body showed evidence of having had more initial resources than Liselotte. Better quality clothes, a backpack with some supplies, even some preserved food remaining when she died, uneaten. But she had died anyway. The cause appeared to be psychological collapse. She had food, but could not force herself to eat it. She had shelter, but could not force herself to continue. She had simply given up, lying down and allowing death to take her despite having resources that could have sustained her longer. Katrine Schmidt had survived longer. 8 weeks before death, she had been in better physical condition initially, younger, more body fat reserves, more strength, but she had died from inefficient resource management. Evidence suggested she had consumed all her food very quickly in the first 2 weeks, then had nothing. She had not rationed, had not planned beyond immediate hunger, had not calculated survival time based on available resources. She had lived day to day, consuming what she had until it was gone, then starving rapidly once resources were exhausted. Brennan presented his findings to the medical staff at an evening conference. 3 girls, he said, displaying photographs on a board, similar age range, same general circumstances, same timeline, all hiding alone in ruins within a few kilometers of each other. He paused, letting the information settle. 2 of them died. 1 had more resources initially. 1 had better physical condition. Both had advantages that Liselotte Krauss did not have. And he displayed the comparison data on charts. But Liselotte survived. The difference was not physical, it was psychological, methodological. She approached survival as a problem requiring systematic solution. She calculated, she experimented, she documented, she managed every resource with ruthless efficiency. Major Whitmore spoke up from his seat. The others endured passively. She managed actively. That appears to be the critical distinction for survival. Yes, Brennan agreed. Endurance is passive acceptance of circumstances. Management is active intervention. Liselotte did not just suffer and hope for rescue. She actively intervened in her own survival process. She turned it into something she could control through knowledge and discipline. One of the nurses raised her hand with a question. "But at what psychological cost, Captain? Those other girls died as themselves, frightened, yes, desperate, certainly, but still fully human, still capable of normal emotional responses. Liselotte survived by suppressing her humanity, by becoming something almost machine-like. Is that really a better outcome?" No one had a comfortable answer to that question, because the nurse had identified the central moral dilemma. The 2 dead girls had remained fully human until they died. Scared, sad, lonely, feeling everything that a person should feel in those terrible circumstances. Liselotte had survived by shutting down those feelings, by becoming a biological calculator that optimized survival variables instead of a person who experienced suffering. Was that preferable? Survival without humanity? Life without feeling? The question would haunt everyone who treated her, because there was no objectively correct answer. 3 weeks after Liselotte's arrival, while cleaning and organizing her few belongings, a nurse found something hidden in the lining of her dress, a small notebook, 15 pages, filled with microscopic handwriting in German, words packed densely together to conserve precious paper. The nurse brought it to Brennan immediately, recognizing its potential significance. He read it that night, alone in his office, translating the German carefully, trying to understand what this document revealed about Liselotte's mental state during her ordeal. The notebook was systematically organized into 3 sections. The first section was dated from late February, before Liselotte had gone into hiding. It contained observations of other refugees, 17 different people that she had watched and studied in the chaotic days after her family died, before she made the decision to hide. The entries were clinical, detached, as though she had been conducting anthropological research rather than observing fellow suffering humans. Subject 1, female, approximately 40 years, crying constantly, unable to control emotional responses. Outcome, died within 1 week. Hypothesis, uncontrolled emotional expression consumes excessive energy and impairs rational decision-making, reducing survival probability. Subject 5. Male, approximately 55 years, refused to eat available food because it was wrong kind or not proper. Outcome: died within 2 weeks. Hypothesis: psychological inflexibility and inability to adapt standards to circumstances reduces survival probability. Subject 12. Female, approximately my age, gave all her food portions to younger children despite her own hunger. Outcome: died within 10 days. Hypothesis: altruistic behavior, while morally admirable, is not compatible with individual survival in conditions of extreme scarcity. She had been conducting systematic field research, studying what killed people and what kept them alive, learning from the deaths of others before entering her own survival situation, building an evidence base to inform her own strategies. The second section contained daily logs from her time in hiding, more detailed than the wall marks, calorie calculations with precise arithmetic, body measurements estimated using finger widths and hand spans as measuring tools, temperature estimates, detailed observations of physical and mental changes, but also tactical notes, observations about which activities consumed the most energy, which positions allowed the best rest, which thought patterns helped maintain morale versus which ones led toward despair. It was a survival manual written in real time by someone living the experience. The third section contained contingency planning, scenarios with probability assessments, decision trees for different potential outcomes. Plan A: if found before June 15th, estimated survival probability 70%. Reasoning: body still functional enough for medical intervention to succeed. Plan B: if found June 15th to 30th, estimated survival probability 40%. Reasoning: approaching limits of medical recovery. Organ damage may be irreversible. Plan C: if not found by July 1st, attempt to reach nearest refugee column despite weakness, estimated survival probability 10%. Reasoning: almost certainly too weak to travel, but remaining in place guarantees death, so low probability action becomes rational choice. Plan D: if too weak to attempt Plan C by July 15th, cease survival efforts. Reasoning: continued suffering with zero survival probability is inefficient allocation of remaining energy. Better to cease struggling and allow death to proceed without further pain. She had calculated the exact date when rational analysis would dictate giving up and dying. July 15th. If she had not been found by then, she had planned to stop consuming clay, stop managing her survival, and simply let death come. It was the most coldly logical approach to suicide that Brennan had ever encountered, not driven by despair or unbearable pain, just a calculated decision that continued suffering with zero probability of survival was illogical, wasteful of energy that could be better used to make the end less prolonged. But the final page of the notebook was different. Everything that came before had been written in neat, controlled handwriting, organized, systematic, the work of someone in complete control of their mental faculties. The final page was different. The handwriting changed, became rushed, irregular. The careful, analytical style broke down into something rawer, more emotional, more human. This entry was dated May 27th, just 1 week before she was found. Brennan read it slowly, feeling something break in his chest as he absorbed the words. "I miss Mama. I miss her so much it feels like my chest is being crushed from the inside. I want to cry, but I only allow myself 10 minutes and it is never enough. Never enough to express what I feel. I want to scream, but it wastes air that I need for breathing. I want to give up, but the data is not complete, and if I die now, then everything I suffered means nothing. All this pain will have been for nothing. I know what I am doing to myself. I understand exactly what I am choosing. I am choosing survival over humanity. I am becoming something cold and hard and strange. Something that can calculate but cannot feel. But if I stay fully human, if I let myself feel everything, I will die. I will die crying in these ruins, and no one will ever know that I tried. No one will benefit from what I learned. So I choose this. I choose to be an analyst instead of a girl. I choose to document instead of despair. I choose to make my suffering useful instead of just enduring it. Maybe that makes me a monster. Maybe I am destroying something essential in myself that can never be recovered. But monsters survive when girls do not. Calculators endure when humans cannot. If someone finds this notebook, I want them to know I knew the price I was paying. I chose it anyway. I paid it willingly with full understanding of what I was trading. Do not pity me. I made the only rational choice available under the circumstances. Use the data. Learn from what I documented. Let my suffering create knowledge that helps someone else survive. And if I survive this, if someone finds me in time, I do not know what I will be anymore. The girl who entered these ruins in March is already dead. She died slowly over these months, sacrificed deliberately for the sake of biological continuation. What walks out, if anything walks out, will be something different. Something that knows how to calculate survival variables, but might have forgotten how to feel human emotions. Something that can endure anything, but might not remember why endurance matters. I am afraid of what I am becoming, but I am more afraid of dying. So I continue, I calculate, I document, I endure, and I hope that whoever I become, it will be someone who survived. Because survival is all that matters now. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is expendable. LK. Brennan read the entry 3 times. Then he closed the notebook and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall of his office without seeing it. Lieselotte had known. She had understood exactly what she was doing to herself, the sacrifice she was making, the parts of herself she was destroying in order to preserve biological function. She had not been damaged by trauma involuntarily. She had not dissociated unconsciously. She had made a deliberate choice, fully aware of the cost, to become something that could survive at the expense of everything that made survival worthwhile. That was somehow more heartbreaking than any unconscious psychological break could have been, because it meant she had watched herself transform, had documented her own psychological death with the same precision that she documented her physical decline. She had been aware, conscious, choosing this path with open eyes. The next morning, Brennan brought the notebook to Major Whitmore. They read the final entry together, sitting in Whitmore's office as morning light filtered through the window. She knew, Whitmore finally said, his voice quiet. She was not delusional, not disconnected from reality. She understood exactly what she was trading. Humanity for survival, the capacity to feel for the capacity to endure. And she chose survival, Brennan said, consciously, with full awareness of the price. Yes. They sat with that truth for a long moment. Is that psychological damage? Brennan asked. Or is that the ultimate expression of rational will, the ultimate survival choice? Whitmore was silent for nearly a minute before responding. Both, he finally said. It is both simultaneously. She saved herself by destroying herself. She survived by becoming someone who could survive. And the tragedy is that she watched herself transform. She documented her own psychological death with the same precision that she documented her body's decline. He looked at Brennan with troubled eyes. Can we help her come back from this? Brennan asked. Can she reintegrate what she suppressed? Can the girl she was before still be recovered somehow? I do not know, Whitmore said honestly. She has been operating in this analytical mode for 4 months. It has become her default state, her identity. Asking her to give it up is asking her to become vulnerable again, and vulnerability nearly killed her. Why would she risk returning to a state that almost destroyed her? Because the danger is over, Brennan said. The war is over. She is safe now. Is she? Whitmore asked. Her parents are still dead. She is still alone. She still has no home, no family, no clear future. The immediate threat of starvation is gone, yes, but she still faces an uncertain and potentially dangerous world. And as long as she perceives ongoing threat of any kind, she will likely maintain the psychological adaptations that kept her alive. Brennan understood what Whitmore was saying. Liselotte might never feel safe enough to risk becoming fully human again. The analytical armor she had constructed might be permanent because the world would never be safe enough to justify removing it. What do we do? Brennan asked. We give her options, Whitmore said. We help her build a future. We show her that she can have purpose and value beyond just surviving. And we accept that she may never be the girl she was before. That girl is gone. We are working with whoever she has become. It felt inadequate, incomplete, but it was all they could ethically do. The refeeding protocol began on June 10th, 1 week after Liselotte Krauss arrived at the Waldheim displaced persons camp. Captain Brennan explained the standard approach: 400 calories on the first day, gradual increases over weeks, careful monitoring for refeeding syndrome. The medical team had treated hundreds of starvation cases. They knew the protocols, they knew what worked. But Liselotte had other ideas. She listened to Brennan's explanation carefully, asked to see the research literature supporting the protocol. When he provided the studies, she read through them with focused attention, making mental notes, performing calculations. Then she argued. The caloric increase rate is too conservative for my specific case, she said. Based on my documented physiological changes over 80 days, I calculate that I can safely process 600 calories initially, with increases of 100 calories every 3 days rather than the standard every 5 days. Brennan tried to explain. Fräulein Krauss, this protocol has been developed based on extensive clinical experience, but not with patients who have precise documentation of their entire starvation process, Liselotte countered. I have data that your other patients could not provide. I know exactly how my body responded at different caloric levels. That information should inform individualized treatment rather than applying a one-size-fits-all protocol. She was not being difficult or rebellious. She was simply applying the same methodical approach that had kept her alive, insisting that her recovery should be managed with the same precision and evidence-based reasoning that she had applied to survival. Every meal became a negotiation. Liselotte wanted to know exact nutritional content, protein grams, micronutrient composition. She requested daily copies of her blood work. She asked to review her cardiac monitoring results. She treated her own recovery as another experiment requiring careful documentation and analysis. The medical staff found it exhausting. They were accustomed to patients who accepted treatment passively, who trusted medical authority. But after 2 weeks of constant resistance, Brennan had a realization. Liselotte was not trying to be difficult, she was trying to maintain control. Because control had been the thing that kept her alive. Her ability to calculate, to manage, to make informed decisions about her body had been the difference between survival and death. Now in the camp, that control was being taken away. Medical staff were making decisions about her body without her participation. For someone who had survived through maximum control over minimum resources, this loss of autonomy felt threatening, dangerous. Brennan made a controversial decision. On June 22nd, he called Liselotte into his office with a proposal. I want to try something different, he said. I want to include you as a collaborator in your own treatment planning. Not as a patient being treated, but as a partner in the process. He showed her the complete medical literature on refeeding protocols, research studies, case reports, the theoretical frameworks guiding treatment. Study these, he said. Apply your analytical abilities, then propose a modified protocol that you believe would be more effective for your specific case. If your reasoning is medically sound and the approach is safe, we will implement it. For the first time since arriving, something shifted in Lieselotta's expression. Not quite emotion, but something human beneath the analytical mask. She spent 3 days reviewing the literature, taking notes, performing calculations. Then she presented a detailed proposal. Higher initial calories, 600 instead of 400, but with enhanced safety measures, blood work twice daily instead of once, continuous cardiac monitoring for the first week, immediate intervention protocols if any parameters moved outside safe ranges. The logic was sound. Her approach accepted marginally more risk, but with compensating safeguards. It was aggressive, but not reckless. Brennan consulted Whitmore about the psychological implications. "Are we reinforcing unhealthy control needs?" he asked. "Perhaps," Whitmore said, "but forcing her into passive patient role might cause worse damage. She survived by being active and analytical. Stripping that away could trigger complete psychological breakdown. Let her participate, see what happens." They implemented her protocol. It worked remarkably well. Week 1, 68 pounds to 73 pounds. Week 4, 73 to 84 pounds. Week 8, 84 to 96 pounds. Week 12, 96 to 107 pounds. The physical recovery exceeded expectations. Brennan documented it carefully, recognizing the case's value for future treatment development, but psychological progress remained elusive. Whitmore continued his sessions with Lieselotta throughout her physical recovery. He tried different therapeutic approaches, attempted to encourage emotional reintegration, explored her grief, worked to rebuild capacity for feeling. The sessions revealed a persistent pattern. Whitmore would ask about emotions. Lieselotta would provide analytical descriptions of emotional states without experiencing them. He would try to explore her loss. She would acknowledge it intellectually while maintaining complete emotional distance. "Your mother died," Whitmore said during one session. "You lost your entire family. That is profoundly traumatic. How are you processing that grief?" "I allocated structured time for grief processing during hiding," Lieselotta said. 10 minutes daily. That approach maintained psychological stability. I continue using it. The grief exists as a documented fact, but controlled expression prevents impairment of function. "But you are not in survival crisis anymore," Whitmore pointed out. "You can feel things fully now without it threatening your life." Lieselotta's gaze remained steady. "Can I?" she asked. "The world remains unpredictable. I have no family, no clear future. If I allow myself to feel the full weight of loss, I may lose the capacity to function, and functional capacity enables survival." "Lieselotta," Whitmore said, using her first name deliberately, "you are not just surviving anymore. You can actually live now. Build a real life. But living requires more than function. It requires connection, joy, the full range of human experience, including grief." "Why?" The question was genuine, not confrontational. "If I can function effectively through pure rationality, why should I accept the vulnerability that emotion requires? What practical benefit does emotional capacity provide?" Whitmore had no satisfactory answer, because in purely functional terms she was right. She could survive, even thrive, without emotional connection. She had proven that. The question was whether that kind of existence constituted living in any meaningful sense, but he could not answer that for her. In his clinical notes, Whitmore documented his diagnostic concept: crisis rationality, an adaptive state where life-threatening prolonged stress triggers hyper-analytical thinking that suppresses emotional processing. It was functional, effective, it kept people alive. But it created profound problems when the crisis ended, because the person had restructured their entire identity around analytical survival. Asking them to dismantle that framework felt like asking them to give up the very thing that made them special. By August, Lieselotta had recovered physically to the point where discharge from intensive medical care was appropriate. 107 pounds, stable, functional. The staff debated what to do: continue attempting psychological treatment or accept her current state as functional enough. Nurse Aldrich advocated for continued intervention. She is 17, her whole life ahead. We cannot let her spend the next 60 years emotionally shut down. But others disagreed. Who are we to decide how she should live? She functions. She is not psychotic or dangerous, just different. Unusual, but stable. Whitmore offered his perspective. Crisis rationality can potentially be modified over time, but not through forced therapy. Lisa Lott has to choose to reintegrate emotions. We cannot make that choice for her. Brennan made the final decision. They would support her recovery without forcing psychological change, provide opportunities for emotional reintegration, but respect her choices. In December 1945, Brennan presented Lisa Lotta's case at a medical conference in Frankfurt. The presentation was titled Adaptive Hyperrationality in Extreme Survival, a Case Study. He described the wall marks, the notebook, the systematic experimental approach, the unusual physiological patterns her body displayed. The medical audience listened in absorbed silence. When the presentation was published in the Journal of Military Medicine, responses flooded in. 14 other doctors reported similar cases, young people, mostly women, who had survived through what Whitmore termed crisis rationality. A pattern was identified. Under extreme circumstances, some individuals could suppress emotional processing so completely that survival probability increased dramatically. The medical community debated whether this represented peak human resilience or tragic psychological damage. No consensus emerged because the answer depended on values that science could not measure. September 1945. Lisa Lotta was discharged from intensive care. Brennan met with her to discuss future options, vocational training programs, possible adoption placement, psychiatric treatment facilities. "I want medical training," Lisa Lotta said immediately. "Laboratory work, medical records, something analytical where my particular abilities are assets rather than deficits." Brennan understood. She wanted to remain in the analytical world that had become her identity. "That can be arranged," he said. He asked the question that had troubled him for months. "Lisa Lotta, do you have any regrets about the choices you made, about who you became?" She looked at him with that measuring gaze. "I survived, Captain. That was the objective. I achieved it." Regret is an emotion that serves no current purpose. It cannot change the past. It can only interfere with present function. Even now, even when asked directly about feelings, she could only respond with analysis. "I hope," Brennan said quietly, "that someday you find something worth feeling again, something that makes vulnerability seem worthwhile." "Perhaps," Lisa Lotta said, "but I do not need hope. I need purpose, and I have that." It was the saddest statement Brennan had ever heard. The years that followed blurred into pattern. 1946 through 50, vocational training, medical stenography, perfect performance, no emotional connections. 1951, immigration to Canada, Toronto, St. Michael's Hospital, medical records department. She stayed 47 years. Colleagues described her the same way across decades. Brilliant but distant, capable but unreachable. Someone you worked with but never knew. She never married, never had children. Lived alone in a small, immaculately organized apartment. Annual psychological evaluations showed the same results. No pathology, no danger, just emotional restriction. High function without joy. One evaluator in 1970 wrote, "Subject functions perfectly as a professional, but appears to experience no emotional depth, going through motions of living without being alive." 1998, Lisa Lotta retired at age 70 after 47 years of service. Small ceremony. Polite speeches, she accepted recognition without visible emotion, thanked everyone, prepared for the next phase with characteristic calculation. She died 4 months later. Heart attack. Found after 3 days when she missed a medical appointment. No family to claim her belongings. Hospital administrators handled her estate. The apartment revealed the final truth. immaculately organized, no photographs, no mementos, just medical charts on walls, research papers, and journals. 47 years of daily logs, weight, food consumed, sleep hours, health metrics. She had spent nearly 5 decades continuing the documentation practice that kept her alive in 1945. She had never stopped measuring. On her desk they found a letter, addressed to medical professionals, dated April 15, 1998, 2 weeks before her death. The letter read, "I am the subject from Waldheim Camp, case number 2847, published December 1945. For 53 years, people have asked whether my survival broke me, whether I lost humanity in those ruins, whether I should have been fixed to feel normally. After more than half a century, my answer, I do not know. I survived by suppressing emotion to maximize rational function. In those ruins, this saved my life. Emotion would have killed me. Calculation kept me breathing, but the war ended and I remained locked in analytical mode. Not because I had to anymore, but because I no longer knew how to be anything else. I spent 53 years functioning perfectly. I worked without error. I contributed to medical care for thousands of patients through accurate documentation. By objective measures, I was successful, productive, valuable. But I never loved anyone, never felt joy the way I remember from childhood, never cried except during scheduled 10-minute periods that I eventually discontinued as unnecessary. I traded 53 years of life for 53 years of existence. Some will call this tragedy, others will call it triumph. I call it the price of survival, when survival required destroying the parts of myself that made survival worthwhile. My body is donated to University of Toronto Medical School per arrangements made in 1982. Let students study how extreme starvation affects human physiology. Let them learn from my preserved tissues. Do not mourn me. Mourning requires emotional investment that would be wasted on someone who stopped being fully human in 1945. Document me instead. Study the data. Learn from the case. If there is a lesson, it is this. Survival is not the same as living. I survived extraordinarily. I never learned to live. Some transformations cannot be reversed. Some prices cannot be refunded. I became what survival required. I remained that way until death. Make of that what you will. Lieselotte Krause, April the 15th, 1998. The letter was preserved in medical archives, read by future generations of doctors and students, a testament to the price of survival when survival required sacrificing humanity for calculation. Brennan had died in 1986, 11 years before Lieselotte, but in his memoir published in 85, he had written extensively about her case. He described visiting her in Toronto in 1972. They met for coffee, talked for an hour, pleasant, professional, emotionally empty. He had asked her the question that haunted him. If you could go back to March 1945, knowing what survival would cost, would you make the same choice? Would you still hide in those ruins? She had answered without hesitation. Yes, because the alternative was death. Even emotionally limited life is preferable to no life. I survived. That was the goal. But do you ever wish you could feel things again? He pressed. Sometimes I remember what joy felt like, she had said. I remember loving my mother. I remember connection. And sometimes I recognize intellectually that I no longer have access to those experiences. But I cannot feel grief about that loss because grief requires the emotional capacity that was lost. It is self-reinforcing, circular. In his memoir, Brennan reflected, I left that meeting feeling profound sadness for Lieselotte. She survived the unsurvivable. She lived 53 years longer than she should have. But the person who survived was not the person who entered those ruins. That girl died there. What walked out was something that could endure but not feel, function but not live. 2000 Medical School Lecture, University of Toronto. Professor presents Lieselotte's case, shows wallmark photographs, describes the clay experiments. the systematic survival methodology. Students listen with fascination. This is extraordinary resilience, remarkable will to survive. Then the professor shows the final letter. The question about survival versus living. The room grows quiet. Was this triumph or tragedy? The professor asks. A student speaks. She lived 53 years without love or joy. That seems tragic regardless of physical survival. Another disagrees. But she chose this consciously. She understood the price. Who are we to say her choice was wrong? The professor nods. Lieselot forces us to confront difficult questions. Our medical goal is preserving life. But what kind of life? If survival costs us capacity for joy, for connection, for meaning, have we really saved anything worthwhile? Silence. There are no easy answers, the professor continues. Lieselot herself could not answer whether her survival was worthwhile. She could only observe that she had paid a price that could not be refunded. The lecture ends. The students file out, debating questions with no comfortable answers. And in the archives, Lieselot's final letter remains, evidence of the highest price imaginable for survival. She measured dying so precisely that she postponed it for 70 years. But she never quite figured out how to measure living. That gap between survival and life, between function and feeling, between calculation and connection, contains the truth of what she became and what she lost. The girl who entered the ruins in March 1945 died there, slowly, deliberately, sacrificed by her own choice for the sake of biological continuation. What walked out was something else, something that could endure anything but could not remember why endurance mattered. Triumph or tragedy? The question remains unanswered. Perhaps it will always remain unanswered, because some stories resist neat conclusions. Some prices leave debts that can never be understood or resolved. Lieselotte Krause survived. That is indisputable. Whether she should have survived that way, whether the cost justified the result, whether existence without living was better than no existence at all, these questions have no answers that satisfy everyone. She offered the data, the documentation, the careful record of what she endured and what she became, and left others to decide what it meant.